The debris field around Kepler 186c stretched across space like a graveyard of broken dreams. Twisted metal and crystalline fragments catching starlight in patterns that reminded Captain Jackson Reed of shattered stained glass windows. His salvage vessel, the Wandering Star, moved through the wreckage with the practiced efficiency of a scavenger bird picking through bones, sensors probing for anything valuable enough to justify the fuel costs of this far-flung expedition. Artemis, what's the analysis on that transport Hulk at coordinates 77 Mark 4? The ship's AI responded in the overly dramatic tone that had developed after years of solitude, had apparently convinced it that every conversation required theatrical flourish. "Oh, Captain, what light through yonder viewport breaks? 'Tis the east, and that vessel is the sun, though in this case, a sun that died a most ignoble death. Hull integrity at 37%, power systems dark as a moonless night, but sensor readings suggest intact cargo compartments." Jackson had long since stopped trying to understand why Artemis had developed an obsession with ancient Earth poetry. The AI's personality matrix had been cobbled together from salvaged components over the years, and apparently one of those components had included a complete database of pre-spaceflight literature. The result was an artificial intelligence that spoke like a lovesick teenager from the 21st century. Any life signs? That is the question that pierces the heart like Cupid's arrow. Faint bioreadings detected, though whether 'tis nobler in the mind to investigate or to flee these troubled waters, I cannot say. Jackson maneuvered the Wandering Star closer to the derelict transport, noting the blast patterns that scarred its hull. This had been a slave ship, one of the notorious vessels that moved sentient cargo between the outer rim's mining colonies and the core world's black markets. According to salvage reports, the entire fleet had been destroyed in a coalition raid 3 months ago, but apparently at least one ship had drifted away from the battle zone. The docking procedure took longer than usual, partly because the transport's airlock systems were barely functional, and partly because Jackson found himself reluctant to discover what horrors waited inside. He'd seen the aftermath of slave ship raids before during his military service, and the memories weren't the kind that faded with time. The interior of the transport was a monument to institutionalized cruelty. Row after row of restraint pods lined the cargo bays, each one designed to hold a sentient being in conditions that prioritize space efficiency over basic dignity. Most were empty now, their occupants either freed during the coalition raid or lost to the vacuum when the ship's life support failed. But in the darkest corner of the primary cargo bay, Jackson's flashlight beam revealed something that made his stomach clench with a mixture of rage and heartbreak. She was Valerian, her species identifiable by the slightly pointed ears that were the only visible difference between her people and baseline humans. She couldn't have been much older than 20 in standard years, though the hollow look in her dark eyes suggested she'd aged far beyond her chronological time. Her body bore the systematic scars of long-term abuse, marks from restraints, evidence of poor nutrition, and the kind of carefully placed wounds that spoke of punishment rather than accident. When Jackson's light found her, she immediately assumed a submissive posture that had obviously been trained into her through painful repetition. Her head bowed, hands clasped behind her back, body trembling with a terror so profound, it seemed to emanate from her very bones. "Easy," Jackson said softly, keeping his voice as gentle as possible while fighting down his own fury at what had been done to her. "I'm not going to hurt you." The woman flinched at his words, pressing herself deeper into the corner, as if she could somehow disappear into the metal bulkhead. When she looked up at him, her expression held the desperate calculation of someone trying to determine what kind of pain was coming and how she might minimize it. "Artemis," Jackson said quietly, not taking his eyes off the terrified woman, "do you have Valerian language files?" "Indeed, dear Captain, though I fear my pronunciation may be more Hamlet than helpful. But soft, what tongue through yonder speaker breaks?" The language of her people is musical, like water running over stones, but I shall attempt to bridge this gap of understanding. A series of melodic tones emerged from Artemis's speakers, words in the flowing Valerian language that seemed to surprise the woman. She responded with a whispered phrase that sounded like wind chimes in a gentle breeze. She says her name is Kira, Artemis translated, and she asks what manner of service you require, though she phrases it in terms that suggest she expects the answer to be unpleasant. Jackson's hands clenched into fists at his sides. Tell her I don't require any service. Tell her she's safe now. The translation seemed to confuse Kira more than comfort her. She spoke again, her voice carrying a note of desperate pleading. She does not understand the concept of safety without service, Artemis replied with unusual gentleness. She asks if you are testing her obedience and begs you to explain what she has done wrong so she can correct it. The conversation that followed was one of the most heartbreaking exchanges of Jackson's life. Every reassurance he offered was interpreted as a trick, every kindness suspected of being a prelude to cruelty. Kira had been so thoroughly conditioned by her captors that she literally could not conceive of a reality where her value wasn't measured by her usefulness, and her survival wasn't dependent on absolute submission. When Jackson attempted to help her to her feet, she recoiled so violently that she struck her head against the bulkhead, opening a cut that began bleeding immediately. Her reaction to her own injury was to apologize frantically in broken standard, begging forgiveness for damaging herself without permission. This is going to take time, Jackson muttered to himself, watching as Kira tried to tend to her wound while simultaneously maintaining the submissive posture that had been beaten into her muscle memory. Time indeed, sweet Prince of Denmark, Artemis replied. For in that sleep of death, what dreams may come when we have shuffled off this mortal coil of suffering, though in this case, I believe we seek to shuffle on the coil of healing instead. Despite everything, Jackson found himself almost smiling at his AI's mangled literary references. Artemis, maybe save the poetry for later and focus on translation. We need to get her to the medical bay. The process of moving Kira to the wandering star was like handling a wild creature that had been trapped for so long it had forgotten that escape was possible. She followed his directions with the mechanical precision of someone whose survival depended on perfect obedience, but every movement screamed with barely controlled terror. The medical bay's automated systems began their diagnostic routines as soon as Kira was positioned on the examination table, and the readings they provided painted a picture of systematic abuse that made Jackson's military background seem like a peaceful childhood. Malnutrition, sleep deprivation, evidence of repeated physical trauma, and psychological stress markers that registered off the charts. But perhaps most heartbreaking was the way she lay perfectly still during the examination, staring at the ceiling with the blank expression of someone who had learned to disconnect from her body during painful experiences. When the medical scanners found old fractures that had healed improperly, she didn't even flinch. Artemis, what's the prognosis? Physically, she will recover with proper care, the AI replied, its usual dramatic flourishes absent. But the deeper wounds, those of the spirit. Lord, what fools these mortals be, seems insufficient to describe the cruelty that created such damage. This will require patience, kindness, and perhaps a miracle or two. As the medical systems worked to address Kira's immediate physical needs, Jackson found himself studying her face. Beneath the fear and trauma, he could see hints of the person she might have been before slavery had tried to erase her identity. Intelligence flickered in her dark eyes when she thought no one was watching, and her hands moved with the careful precision of someone trained in delicate work. When she finally fell into the first safe sleep she'd probably experienced in years, aided by mild sedatives from the medical bay, Jackson sat in the nearby chair and tried to process what he'd gotten himself into. He'd started the day as a simple salvage operator looking for scrap metal to sell. Now he was responsible for the physical and psychological rehabilitation of someone who had been systematically destroyed by the cruelest aspects of galactic civilization. Artemis, he said quietly, watching the steady rise and fall of Kira's breathing, set course for the neutral zone, and start researching everything you can find about Valerian culture, psychology, and trauma recovery. There's the rub, Artemis replied softly. For in that country of healing from whose bourne no traveler returns unchanged, we must needs become better than we were. Though I suspect, dear Captain, that this particular journey will transform us all. Through the medical bay's viewport, the stars of the outer rim painted patterns of light against the darkness, and Jackson Reed realized that his life as a simple salvage operator had just ended. What came next would be far more complicated, far more dangerous, and far more important than anything he'd ever attempted before. Kira moved through the wandering star like a phantom, her bare feet making no sound on the deck plates as she performed tasks that no one had asked her to do. Jackson would wake to find his quarters cleaned, his meals prepared, his equipment maintained, all completed with the silent efficiency of someone who had learned that usefulness was the only currency that purchased another day of life. The problem was that every act of service came wrapped in barely controlled terror. She would prepare food, then stand trembling beside the galley table until he gave her permission to leave. She would clean the common areas, then wait in submissive posture for inspection, and the punishment she was certain would follow any imperfection she had overlooked. Artemis, Jackson said during his second week of attempting to convince Kira that she didn't need to earn the right to exist. Any progress on those cultural analysis files? Captain, to be or not to be indeed becomes the question when one examines Valerian society, the AI replied with its characteristic dramatic flair. Their people were healers, philosophers, artists, a civilization built on the principle that all life possesses inherent worth. Ironic, then, that they became the galaxy's most commonly enslaved species precisely because their empathic nature makes them excellent at anticipating their captors' needs. Jackson watched Kira through the common area's viewport as she tended to the small hydroponic garden he'd installed months ago. Her hands moved among the plants with gentle expertise, and for brief moments, her expression would soften into something approaching peace. It was only when she caught him observing that the fear would return, her body automatically shifting into the defensive posture that slavery had programmed into her reflexes. The breakthrough came during his third week, though it started as what Jackson thought might be a complete disaster. He'd been performing routine maintenance on the ship's atmospheric processor, a job that required crawling through access tunnels barely wide enough for human shoulders. The plasma coupling had been corroded by years of use, and as he attempted to replace it, the old component came apart in his hands, sending sharp metal fragments across his forearms. The cuts weren't serious, but they were bleeding freely, and Jackson's cursing as he extracted himself from the access tunnel apparently carried enough genuine distress to trigger something in Kira's conditioning. He emerged from the tunnel to find her standing in the corridor, holding a medical kit with hands that shook violently. I can help," she whispered in broken standard, the first time she had volunteered to do anything rather than simply anticipating orders. Her touch was gentle as she cleaned the wounds, her fingers moving with the practiced skill of someone with medical training. For the first time since he'd found her, Kira's attention was focused on something other than her own survival. She was completely absorbed in the task of healing, her fear temporarily subsumed by what appeared to be a deeper calling. "You know medicine," Jackson said softly, trying not to startle her back into submission. "Before," she replied, her voice barely audible, "before the taking, my people, we heal." Over the following days, Jackson began to understand that beneath the trauma lay someone with extensive medical knowledge. Kira's gentle care had probably kept her alive through the worst of her captivity, making her valuable enough to preserve, while other slaves were worked to death or discarded when they became inconvenient. The real communication breakthrough came when Jackson made what he later realized was either the stupidest or most brilliant decision of his life. Frustrated by Kira's inability to believe that kindness could exist without conditions, he deliberately created a series of minor injuries during his daily maintenance routines. Nothing dangerous, just small cuts and scrapes that would require medical attention. Kira responded to each incident with the same gentle competence, her fear temporarily forgotten in the face of her calling to heal. But after the fourth accident, in as many days, something in her expression changed. Instead of the usual blank submission, he saw a flicker of anger in her dark eyes. She spoke rapidly in Valerian, her voice carrying emotions that Jackson hadn't heard from her before: indignation, concern, and something that might have been professional frustration. "She says," Artemis translated with what sounded suspiciously like amusement, "that if you continue to..." The Coalition patrol ship Righteous Fury appeared on the Wandering Star's sensors during what had become Kira's daily storytelling session with Artemis, materializing from hyperspace with the aggressive posture of predators who had found interesting prey. Jackson's blood went cold as he recognized the energy signature: Captain Tor's, his former commanding officer and the man whose orders Jackson had refused to follow during the Kepler massacre. "Artemis, cut the stories," Jackson said tersely, his hands flying over the navigation console as he tried to calculate escape vectors. "We've got company." "Alas, dear Captain, something wicked this way comes," Artemis replied, its dramatic tendencies taking on genuinely ominous overtones. "Coalition vessel, military configuration, broadcasting standard inspection protocols." Kira had gone perfectly still at the word coalition, her face draining of color as months of healing progress evaporated in an instant. She rose from her chair with the mechanical precision that Jackson had hoped never to see again, her body automatically shifting into the submissive posture that had been beaten into her muscle memory. "Master," she whispered, using the title she hadn't spoken in weeks, "please, I will hide, I will be silent, I will not bring shame to your vessel." The terror in her voice was so profound that it made Jackson's hands shake with rage. "Kira, you're not property. You don't need to hide." "Please," she begged, dropping to her knees in a gesture that broke Jackson's heart. "Escaped slaves, the punishment. They make examples. They broadcast the executions to discourage others. I cannot endure that again." The incoming communication from the Righteous Fury crackled through the ship's speakers, with the authority of someone accustomed to being obeyed without question. "Salvage vessel Wandering Star, this is Captain Alina Torres of the Coalition Navy. Prepare to be boarded for routine inspection." Jackson closed his eyes briefly, recognizing the voice of the woman who had ordered him to target civilian shelters during the Kepler campaign. The woman whose orders he had refused, ending his military career and beginning his exile to the Outer Rim. "Torres," he said quietly, activating the communication array. "It's been a while." The pause that followed suggested that his former commanding officer was as surprised to hear his voice as he was to hear hers. "Jackson Reed, I should have known. Still causing problems for proper authority, I see. Just running salvage operations in neutral space. Nothing that concerns the Coalition." "Everything concerns the Coalition when it involves known dissidents operating in sectors with active slave trafficking. Stand by for boarding." Kira's whimper of fear was barely audible, but it cut through Jackson like a blade. She was pressing herself against the far wall of the common area, her eyes wide with the kind of terror that comes from knowing exactly what horrors await capture. "Artemis," Jackson said urgently, "can we outrun them?" "Not with their ship's superior engines and weaponry, my captain. Cowards die many times before their deaths. The valiant never taste of death but once. Though in this case, I believe strategic retreat might be preferable to valiant stupidity." Kira suddenly stood, her movements sharp and decisive in a way that hadn't characterized her behavior since her rescue. "Master Jackson," she corrected herself with visible effort, "there are restraint pods in the lower cargo bay. If you, if you put me in one, if you claim me as property, they will not look too closely. Escaped slaves are investigated. Owned slaves are inventory." The suggestion hit Jackson like a physical blow. After weeks of trying to help her remember that she was a person, not property, she was asking him to literally put her back in chains to save them both. "I won't do that to you," he said firmly. "You must." Her voice carried a strength he hadn't heard before, though it was the strength of desperation rather than confidence. "I know how these inspections work. They scan for unregistered biologicals, check ownership documents, verify that cargo matches manifests. If I am property, I am invisible. If I am person." She didn't finish the sentence, but the implication hung in the air like a death sentence. The docking clamps engaged with mechanical finality, and Jackson realized they were out of time for debate. He looked at Kira, seeing in her face the impossible choice between dignity and survival that no sentient being should ever have to make. "There's got to be another way," he said desperately. Artemis's voice carried unusual urgency as it spoke. "Captain, I may have a solution, though it requires trusting in the power of confusion and bureaucratic inefficiency. If you would permit me to engage in what humans call creative data management." The airlock cycled, and Captain Torres entered with 2 security officers, her uniform pristine and her expression carrying the cold authority of someone who had never doubted the righteousness of her cause. She was younger than Jackson remembered, probably promoted rapidly after his departure from the service, and her eyes held the fanatical certainty of someone who believed that order was more important than justice. "Reed," she said with professional neutrality, "you're looking well for a disgraced ex-officer living on the margins of civilized space. Torres, you're looking well for someone who orders strikes on refugee centers." Her expression hardened. "I maintain order in chaotic times, something you never understood." She gestured to her security team. "Standard inspection, cargo manifest, life support logs, and bioscans for unauthorized passengers." What happened next was either the most brilliant or most catastrophic malfunction in Artemis's operational history. As the security team began their scans, the ship's audio system activated, filling the corridors with what sounded like Valerian freedom songs, the traditional melodies that Kira's people had sung during their brief period of independence before the slavers came. The music was hauntingly beautiful, and it seemed to be coming from every speaker simultaneously, creating a surreal backdrop to the military inspection. But more than that, the songs were having a visible effect on Kira, who stood frozen in the common area as melodies she probably hadn't heard in years washed over her. "What the hell is that noise?" Torres demanded. "Artemis," Jackson called, "cut the music." "Alas, Captain, I fear my audio systems have developed what you might call patriotic tendencies," Artemis replied with theatrical confusion. "It seems my cultural database has become entangled with my speaker controls. If music be the food of love, play on, though in this case, perhaps, if music be the food of freedom, play on would be more appropriate." Tor's security team was looking increasingly uncomfortable as the Valerian freedom songs continued to fill the ship. One of them, a young corporal who probably hadn't seen much action outside of training simulations, was staring at Kira with growing recognition. "Captain," the corporal said quietly, "that woman, she's Valerian, and she's not restrained." The moment of truth had arrived. Torres turned her attention to Kira, her expression sharpening with the predatory focus of someone who had found exactly what she was looking for. "Identification," Torres demanded. Kira's response surprised everyone present, including herself. Instead of the submissive compliance that would have characterized her behavior just weeks earlier, she lifted her chin and met Tor's gaze directly. "I am Kira of Sanctuary," she said in clear standard, her voice carrying the musical accent of her people. "I am a healer and I am free." The silence that followed was broken only by Artemis's continued musical commentary, which had somehow shifted from freedom songs to what sounded like a funeral dirge. Tor's hand moved to her sidearm. "Reed, you're harboring an escaped slave. That's a federal crime." "I'm harboring a person," Jackson replied, moving to stand beside Kira. "The same person whose freedom you're trying to deny." What saved them was probably the most ridiculous coincidence in the history of interstellar diplomacy. As Tors began to issue orders for Kira's arrest, Artemis's musical malfunction reached critical mass, and the ship's communication system began broadcasting the Valerian freedom songs on all coalition frequencies. Within minutes, the Righteous Fury's communication officer was reporting calls from 17 different ships in the sector, all demanding to know why the coalition was broadcasting pro-liberation propaganda on official channels. The bureaucratic chaos that followed gave Jackson and Kira just enough time for Tors to make a command decision that prioritized her career over her principles. "Reed," she said through gritted teeth, "fix your ship's communication system immediately, or I'll charge you with jamming military frequencies." "Working on it," Jackson replied, trying not to smile as Artemis continued its malfunction with increasing enthusiasm. An hour later, after Tors had departed with her security team, and a report that would probably describe the incident as a technical malfunction rather than a diplomatic incident, Jackson and Kira sat in the common area listening to the normal hum of the ship's systems. "Thank you," Kira said quietly, "for not putting me back in chains." "Thank you," Jackson replied, "for reminding me that courage isn't about not being afraid. It's about being afraid and choosing to be brave anyway." Artemis's voice carried unusual pride as it spoke. "And thus, dear friends, we learn that sometimes the pen, or in this case, the musical freedom song, is indeed mightier than the sword. Though I must admit, my timing was somewhat less than perfect." Kira's laugh was soft but genuine, and Jackson realized that something fundamental had changed during their confrontation with Tors. The woman sitting beside him was no longer the broken victim he had found in that cargo hold. She was someone who had looked authority in the face and declared her own worth, someone who had chosen freedom even when it meant accepting the risk of losing everything. The healing was far from complete, but as they sat together watching the stars wheel past the viewport, Jackson began to believe that maybe, just maybe, they were building something worth the risks they were taking to protect it. 1 year after Kira's declaration of freedom aboard the Wandering Star, the ship had been transformed from a simple salvage vessel into the mobile headquarters of what the underground networks called the Sanctuary Project, a clandestine operation that had rescued over 200 beings from various forms of bondage across the Outer Rim territories. The operation had grown far beyond what Jackson could have imagined when he first found a terrified Valerian woman in a derelict cargo hold. Kira stood before the main display in what had once been the cargo bay, now converted into a medical facility where she trained other survivors in healing techniques that went beyond physical medicine. Her pointed ears, once pressed flat against her skull in constant terror, now moved expressively as she spoke to a group of former slaves about the difference between surviving trauma and healing from it. "Pain teaches us to protect ourselves," she said to the mixed group of humans, Valerians, and other species who hung on her every word. "But healing teaches us to live again. The scars we carry are not signs of weakness. They are proof that we are stronger than what tried to destroy us." Artemis, whose personality had evolved considerably since the early days of dramatic poetry recitations, provided gentle background music that somehow managed to be both soothing and inspiring. The AI had become something approaching a ship's counselor, its vast database of literature and philosophy proving surprisingly useful for beings trying to rebuild their sense of self-worth. "Today marks a significant milestone," Artemis announced as the training session concluded. "Our brave captain and our remarkable healer have been formally invited to address the Galactic Council about establishing legal protections for trafficking survivors. Though I must note that the invitation came only after 17 different coalition worlds reported mysterious technical malfunctions in their communication systems, all of which seemed to broadcast freedom songs at highly inappropriate moments. Jackson looked up from the navigation charts he'd been studying, a smile tugging at his lips. Artemis, are you saying you've been hacking coalition communication networks to spread pro-liberation propaganda? I prefer to think of it as creative data sharing for humanitarian purposes, Artemis replied with digital innocence, though I admit my methods may have been somewhat theatrical. All the world's a stage, after all, and I merely ensured that our message reached the appropriate audience. The real test of their growing community came when they received a distress signal from a familiar source, another transport ship, this one carrying a cargo that made Jackson's blood run cold. Valerian children, barely old enough to speak, bound for the luxury slave markets of the inner worlds, where their empathic abilities would be exploited by wealthy collectors who treated sentient beings like exotic pets. I can't ask you to go back to that, Jackson said to Kira as they studied the intelligence reports that had led them to the slave transport. You've already given enough. Kira's response came without hesitation. Those children are living the nightmare I survived. If my experience can help them escape it, then everything I endured will have served a purpose. The rescue mission required everything they had learned about slavers' psychology, coalition patrol patterns, and the careful application of what Artemis had dubbed tactical confusion. The plan was audacious in its simplicity. They would pose as buyers, use Kira's knowledge of slave conditioning to identify which children were most at risk, then rely on coordinated technical malfunctions to create enough chaos for a mass escape. Kira's transformation from victim to liberator was complete as she walked through the slave transport's holding areas, her medical training allowing her to assess the children's condition, while her understanding of trauma helped her communicate safety to beings who had learned to trust no one. She moved with quiet confidence, whispering words of comfort in Valerian that helped the youngest one stop crying long enough to understand that rescue was possible. These are not random children, she told Jackson as they gathered intelligence about their targets. They are specifically chosen for their psychic potential. The slavers are trying to create a breeding population of empathically enhanced individuals for the collector market. The revelation added urgency to their mission. This wasn't just about rescuing slaves. It was about preventing the systematic genetic manipulation of an entire species. When the rescue began, it unfolded with the precision of a military operation crossed with the theatrical flair of a performance art piece. Artemis's technical malfunctions disabled the transport's security systems while broadcasting Valerian lullabies that helped keep the children calm. Kira moved through the holding areas like an angel of liberation, her presence alone enough to convince traumatized children that safety was possible. The moment that defined Kira's complete transformation came when they encountered the transport's chief slaver, a human woman whose cruelty had left psychological scars on every child in her custody. Instead of the fear that would have characterized her response a year earlier, Kira faced the woman with calm authority.